Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good. All right. Great. We got some energy here. So just as a show of hands, who knows what TypeScript is? OK. Who's used TypeScript? OK, quite a few people. And who's used TypeScript with Vue? OK, actually, not too bad. All right. So for those of you who don't know, first off, I'm just going to say we're going to talk about today what it takes to get Vue and TypeScript running together. For those of you who don't know what TypeScript is, you can boil it down to just a very simple concept. TypeScript is JavaScript and types. And when I say types, I really mean static types. Now, what am I talking about when I say static types? Well, when you have JavaScript, you have values, and each of these values intrinsically has a type, even at runtime, right? So when you write 1, 2, 3, or 4, that's a number. True or false has the type Boolean. And strings have the type string. So it's a fairly intuitive concept for primitives. Now, why do you care about what the type of a value is? Well, the type of a value actually determines how it actually acts at runtime, right? So adding two numbers or adding two strings, that's behavior that's defined by the types in JavaScript. But apart from adding two numbers and strings, you get some other slightly less desirable behavior, right? Like when you multiply a string and an array, which gives you potentially different results, and then you add it to a Boolean, that may not be as desirable as you want. And so part of what a type checker does, part of what static types are meant to do, is catch some of these undesirable sort of behaviors with your types. So for instance, wouldn't it be nice if we, even though it's well defined to do this in JavaScript, like there's a well-known semantics here, we could actually avoid ever having to think about, well, I might be doing something a little bit too fishy. And so types do at least that, right? Like a type checker can tell you when you're doing things that are slightly off. It can also tell you when you're using something that may not exist within your program, right? So it can catch a class of things like spelling, misspellings, typos, which, who here has ever mistyped something in JavaScript? Like, you're just not raising your hands, but come on. So, like, I shouldn't even ask that question. So it can catch things like typos, but the cool part is, once it can tell you whether or not your program is, potentially correct or when it's definitely incorrect, types can do a little bit more, such as, well, if it knows the properties in your program, it can not just maybe tell you what you shouldn't be doing, it can tell you maybe what you want to do as well, right? So for instance, you can get nice things like completions from knowing the types, from knowing what properties exist at runtime. Or potentially, if you have an error in your code, TypeScript can actually hint to you, hey, maybe this is the fix that you want to use based on the type information. Or if your type system knows about every property in your program, if everything is well typed, then that means that you can rename something without having to worry about, well, have I renamed it everywhere? Is it actually going to work at runtime now that I've done this sweeping change across my code base? So types give you this really nice level of guarantees, right? And so just an example of what some of these guarantees are, let's actually dive into a quick example. So I'm going to actually show you what type checking looks like, even if you're not in a TS file. One of the new things that TypeScript has actually done is we started adding the ability to start getting type checking within a JavaScript file. And so if you're using Visual Studio Code, by the way, can everyone read up here? Yeah, no? OK, I'm seeing some no in the back. So better? OK, great. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just add this @tscheck comment, which is really convenient because now I can get checking in any JavaScript file that I have, right? I don't even need to have a build step. So I look through a couple of these. I see something like, well, it's a little hard to read up here, but basically it's saying you can only specify known properties here, and I've never seen read-only in this type. So, well, let's dive through this. We've dove into what's called a declaration file, which tells TypeScript, hey, here's what the types look like at runtime. Here's the shape of all the things that are available to you that you can use and how to use them appropriately. So the type that I was mentioning earlier was a property descriptor. If I jump into that, I see it says configurable, enumerable, value, and writable. But I wrote read-only. So instead of read-only, I probably meant to do writable true. Oops. And of course, I misspelled writable, and it says, did you mean to write writable? So I didn't mean to use that A there. And actually, if I just let the completion go through, again, TypeScript giving you the tooling to do more based on your types. I would have avoided that error entirely. Then here we're seeing, hey, you're trying to give me an HTML element, but I'm expecting a string. So what I probably meant to do was extract the HTML out of the element, or the text out of the element. And by show of hands, who here has ever forgotten to unwrap something from some value, like a promise or an HTML element? Like, it's a pretty common error. So forgetting to await a promise or something like that is something that TypeScript can help you with. And then here, we're seeing like, hey, you're using this arithmetic operation, and maybe a beginner mistake, you probably meant to use double bar instead of single bar. Because we always use single bar, right, in JavaScript, so clearly we can catch this before we hit the browser. And this one is kind of like close to my heart because at my last company, we actually had a database field called delivery instead of delivery. And so TypeScript can catch really stupid misspellings as well, and it can give us hints to say like, hey, you might have misspelled this, and I'll give you a quick fix to actually fix this up. So just by turning on type checking, right, actually seeing whether or not our code makes sense, and not even having to write a type, I caught a couple of bugs. But now in JavaScript, if I want to start adding in a type annotation, I can actually add in a couple of things because right now we see this email address parameter has the type any, which means I can be as flexible as possible with it. I can do anything I want with it. So we want to actually specify a type. We want to say that this is a string or an array of strings. And now I actually get some information here from the JS doc. And we see that there's actually a bug here, which is that we try to use for each on email address, but it's saying for each doesn't exist on this thing because I can't tell whether or not you actually have an array or if you have a string. And that's because someone who wrote this code actually thought, hey, I can discriminate whether or not this is a string or an array of strings based on whether or not it has a length property. But that's buggy because the length property might be falsy or truthy, or just the fact that strings and arrays of strings are both actually, they have a length property. So I probably meant to use a better check there, like array.isArray. I'll use it on email address. I get some nice completions there. And that works, except now I have this one extra red squiggle, which says trim doesn't exist on the number. So I look at val, it says it's a number. That's weird because I have an array of strings. But I realized that I had index, which is a string. And so someone actually messed up the parameter ordering, which is, again, a really common mistake. So I had to write very few types here in general, right? And this is just in a JavaScript file. But as you might expect, we're talking about TypeScript, and the point here is that JSDoc is a pretty good format for introducing types here and there, but what we feel is that as you get it to a bigger and bigger project, it becomes a little bit cumbersome. So what we can do here is we can switch this to a .ts file. And it's picking up some extra strictness because of the extra settings that I have in this configuration file here for the other files. So I'll just actually remove the JSDoc annotation and throw it in there. Things just work. And again, I'll just add another annotation there. And I notice that it's saying, hey, by the way, you forgot that getElementById potentially returns null. So under the stricter settings, I can actually just say, like, extract this into a constant, call that element, and then I say if element, just throw, oops. So once you're in a TS file, this is basically not too much that you have to actually write in terms of type annotations to actually get the benefits. If I actually take the TypeScript compiler to just strip the types out, oops, 1 second. If I just look at the JavaScript output on the side by side, you'll see that basically we try to be as close as possible to your originally written code. basically writing as close as possible to what a human would have written. And so the only difference is really the new lines and things like that. But this goes beyond just general JavaScript. I think you can get benefits within your Vue files as well. So let's actually take a look at this. Like here, can anyone spot the bug? So someone said props. So let's actually just rename this to .ts. And we see that first name doesn't exist here, and last name doesn't exist here. And if we actually started writing code, right, like as we write the code, we immediately see that there's something wrong. I get a completion for first name, comma, last name. So the bug here is I actually forgot to have 2 quotation marks. And as soon as I fix that up, I know that something is back to normal. Similarly, here, anyone know what the bug is? This, correct. So someone was trying to make their code a little bit shorter by using an arrow function. As soon as I switch TypeScript on here with stricter settings, we can catch these errors. And so, we can turn that into a method. TypeScript needs a little bit of a hint for the annotation here, but things just work. And this final one's a lot easier. Can anyone spot it out? Computed needs to actually not be called, because computed is just a string. It's not actually a method, so we need to be careful there. So the idea is, we want to get some of these benefits in our Vue code, right? So the question is, what does it take to get Vue working with TypeScript and types? And initially, this was not like an easy question to answer. It actually took quite a bit of work on a couple of different, throughout the community and from our team as well. In fact, there was this email that I initially sent out to our team from like way back January of last year saying, hey, I've noticed that there's a couple of issues actually getting a decent experience with TypeScript and Vue based on the way that most people typically want to write Vue. Because at the time, the current recommendation was to use class components and property decorators, which I actually really like in terms of authoring, because I feel like I end up writing a little bit less code. However, I know I didn't want it to be the case that people needed to use TypeScript, who wanted to use TypeScript with Vue, had to use it in a different way. If most people were getting started out with the object-based API, you shouldn't need to learn 2 new concepts at once. And so this was really about bringing TypeScript to where the community already was, and making class components more of an option, so that if you prefer that, then that's awesome. But you didn't have to learn anything new, effectively. And so one of the hard tasks was dealing with metaprogramming in this system. So if you actually break down a Vue typical object component, there's a lot that's actually going on under the hood. And the lucky part is you typically don't need to learn, you don't need to think about it. Greg Pollock covered a bunch of great stuff in his talk yesterday about like what's going on. But if we just take a look at this here, let's think about this. You have props, you have computed, and you have methods, right? And this is like a very basic components. You can have data, you can have watchers as well. But when it comes to type checking, you really want to be able to make good calls over whether or not you're writing correct code. For instance, is it okay for me to, is name a valid property? Is greeting a valid property? Is it a string? Is it a number? What are the valid operations here? And so in order to know what the type of this is, you need to actually, in order to bring yourself some internal consistency for your components, you need to actually break apart your component based on each of these sections. So for instance, from props, we need to try to get something with a name, right? Because we have a string literal, we don't necessarily know, but we at least need to know that we can get a name property out of that. With computed, we have something that returns a string. So we need to at least have a property that is a string on it, is a string, and it has to be called greeting. And with methods, we more or less want to just sort of leave this alone. But in order to even get the fact that, what is the type of greet or greeting in the first place, we need to actually find this fun circular we sort of need to dig through the circularity to actually get the types we're interested in. And so this is not an easy task because, well, it goes into a lot in terms of compiler internals. So I'll say that much. And there's also a bit of metaprogramming, like taking string names and actually transforming that into something that's a little bit into actual property name on an object, right? So it turns out that around that time, we were actually already looking into some interesting metaprogramming ideas in TypeScript 2.1. And I'll spare you the details, but it turns out that it becomes sort of like a really beautiful algebra of string literal types and metaprogramming, which, if you're interested, there's a lot of blog posts out there on the topic. But that was the first step. And the second step was being able to actually control the type of this within one of these objects, which was heavily driven by Vue as a use case, right? So our team actually thinks a lot about how we get TypeScript working with JavaScript in the broad, in the general ecosystem. And so Vue actually drove some features here, which is really cool. And in 2.5, we actually integrated some of these changes into the declaration files that Vue ships with, which is really awesome. So, and just as a shout out, TypeScript 2.8 is out as of yesterday, and so this means that we can make some extra improvements as well. But the neat part was I was able to actually send some of these changes upstream to the Vue project, and though I wasn't able to actually drive it home, we got a lot of help from the community. The core Vue team was really helpful here as well. And so I have a lot of appreciation for that effort because it was not an easy task reviewing any of that stuff. So for anyone who's here, thank you, Evan. Thank you very much for that. So let's actually see what it takes to get it working. And it turns out, for the most part, it's relatively little. So you start out with this object-based API as you would have written it. But the current issue is that TypeScript doesn't have an idea of, hey, with this object literal, how should I know I need to do anything special with the type of this? It needs some extra hint. So if we think about what actually happens at runtime, under the covers, whenever you use one of these components in the components field in Vue, what will happen is, if it's not already a component, Vue will use Vue.extend, or the effective equivalent of that, to turn this into a component. And so if we were able to make that explicit to TypeScript, that would actually take care of that job. We would actually have the machinery in place to control the type of this and to control the type of other things within this object. And it turns out, well, if it's just going to go into Vue.extend, let's just wrap it in Vue.extend. So that's just the first step there. The second is that because there's a lot of circularity, if you remember that slide with all the arrows, the red arrows, we need a little bit of a hint. So TypeScript tries to do some reverse type inference from the computed field. So what this ends up meaning is that whenever you have a computed method, you have to have an explicit return type annotation, which for documentation purposes actually tends to be pretty helpful and clean. So I think really that's all you sort of need to do here while running on some stricter settings for controlling this. Now, naturally, you might ask, well, what about using .vue files? Well, luckily, for your build, you can just use the Vue CLI, right? TypeScript is now an option in Vue CLI's 3.0 version, so I'm very excited for this because you don't have to think as much about your build when you're controlling this. If you do really want to dive into the guts, you'd have to just use tsloader with this little helper, basically telling tsloader, hey, whenever I have a .ts file, a TypeScript file, I want you to actually whenever you see a .vue file, I want you to just consider it a TypeScript file, and I'll hand you the contents you actually care about. So TypeScript's API and tsloader is actually flexible enough to deal with the build system and type checking within a certain region in a .vue file, within the script tag. What about editing? I was just talking about how tooling is like one of the best parts of TypeScript, getting auto-completion and being able to navigate around your project. Well, Pine Wu, who is here, and he's going to be giving a talk later today. I highly encourage you all to check that out. has built the Vue plugin for VS Code. And so if you're, by the way, show of hands who's using VS Code here? OK, that's super cool. Yeah, so Pine's got a great extension. I highly encourage you to use it if you haven't already. Sarah Dresner also has a Vue extension pack, which is also really cool, which includes this. So once you've got Vue, what do you have to do to get that working? Well, again, there's only a very small change that you need to make. From this script block, you basically need to add a lang equals ts and use vue.extend around your object literal. So just to kind of summarize that, all you have to do is use a relatively up-to-date version of TypeScript in Vue. You need to use slightly stricter settings. I didn't allude to this as much, but basically, we have an option called no implicit this, which basically says if you ever use this and TypeScript can't figure out the type of that, you'll get an error effectively. And so when you're going to get an error, we can do a little bit of extra checking to make sure you don't get an error. And that's kind of required here. If you're going to be using .vue files, Vue is an extension I highly encourage you to check out. Use the vue.extend API around object literals and annotate all your computed methods return types. So what does a project using Vue and TypeScript look like here? One second. Let's dig this up. Oops, sorry. So here I have an application called TCQ. So my coworker Brian is, or I think was, the editor of the TC39, the technical committee that actually standardizes JavaScript. And one of the cool projects that we got to work on was this thing called TCQ, which was an app for moderating discussion, basically. So let's do yarn iterate. And so let's actually take a look at what this app looks like. Oops. Shucks, OK. Hold it. Uh-oh. I think I forgot to fill in my application secrets. Sorry about that, everyone. Obviously, demos never actually go perfectly, right? So, OK. Come on, Firefox. Sorry, everyone. I think in the meantime, though, I'll show you why it matters if it was working. So here we have this app, and we don't actually use .vue files here. But what we do use is, because this was actually written just when we were like prototyping and hacking stuff together and seeing like what you could do with the framework in general. But we're using some Webpack plugins to like import CSS and HTML, and we're using some extra helpers as well. But I think the really cool part about this app is that it not only has types that I can find all references within a file, right? I can see who's using this current agenda item property, but also I'm using sockets on the front end and back end so that I can connect to my client and server, right? And with this, I actually have these strongly typed events as well. So for instance, when I do socket.on with this message type, I actually can figure out what the type of this data is, right? Based on like the overloads to this. And we actually have some cool stuff coming up in terms of how to build like these typed event emitters like automatically without having to do any boilerplate. But basically, it's really nice that like I get some nice completions here, and I also know what my payloads are as well. I know what my payloads have as well, and I have to make sure that my payloads are not undefined, right? And this is shared between my client and my server, which is really nice. Oh no! OK, well, let's not mind that too much. Are you sure? OK. I don't want to dwell on that demo too much. But I think the nice part is that the same way that Vue is a progressive framework, TypeScript can accommodate any of the APIs, right? We can use either this pretty cool way of just using Webpack to import our templates. We can use all the new syntax from future ECMAScript features, because TypeScript will just down-level that for us. And additionally, we can actually move to .vue files as well. So as an example, let's take a look at this project, which is really, really basic. This is the Vue starter that we wrote to guide the community towards using TypeScript and Vue together. And I'll actually link you to that in a little bit. But with this, I can actually get some of the support here, hey, I get highlights whenever I click on enthusiasm, and while that might just work for a regular text buffer, this is actually accurate. If we have an unrelated variable named enthusiasm, enthusiasm, we won't get that highlight, right? We can find all references to see where this thing is mutated and checked in general, and this is all in a .vue file, so all the stuff that you're used to with using .vue is still applicable with TypeScript in general. So I don't know. I'm actually really excited by this. If you give this a shot, oh my gosh, now it works? OK. Just so you believe that I actually wrote a Vue app with Brian. Gosh, anyway, almost too late. You can start a new meeting and basically, you can create a new agenda item hello, VueConf, right? And then we can add questions, or actually let's add new topics. And then we can say, I have a question that'll trump the topic's priority. If I ask what, it'll go there first. Yeah, and then point of order, I have an objection. So this is a full stack application, and we're able to get fully typed events between the client and the server, which was kind of part of the point that I was trying to drive as well. Anyway, so, well, that was nice. I highly encourage you to check out the Vue starter that we've built. It predates the CLI, which I would highly more encourage if you're actually going to get started on a project. But if you want to get a more holistic understanding of what it takes to get TypeScript wired up with Vue, just visit this repo. It's on our GitHub. So, that's really what I wanted to sort of drive home. And the thing is, we want to know what we need to take, what steps we need to take next. We have some ideas for improving Vue in general with its integration with TypeScript. Integration with Vuex, so you can get nice typed events the same way when you have actions in your store. Sorry, this is really distracting. But basically, we do want your feedback here. We want to know if you give TypeScript and Vue a try, what that experience was like, whether or not there were any caveats or pitfalls that you ran into. So we're always looking to improve. So as next steps, check out that starter. If you're not that familiar with TypeScript, check out this website. That's our website, and just read the documentation just to get a better handle on the language. TCQ source, that application that was being finicky just a little bit ago, you can check that out as well. It doesn't use .vue files, but it gives you a general sense of what it takes to actually build a Vue application with TypeScript. And again, get in touch. I'm always looking for better feedback on what we can do to improve. So thank you very much, everybody.